The dust had not yet settled on the road into Caldwell, Kansas, when Elara Voss stepped off the stagecoach with nothing but a worn leather satchel, a broken heart she had not yet named, and the fierce, quiet determination of a woman who had run out of every other option. It was the spring of 1879, and Caldwell sat at the edge of the world as far as most people were concerned. A cattle town perched on the Kansas Indian Territory border, raw and loud and smelling of livestock and ambition and things not quite finished. The cattle drives had made it wealthy in a rough sort of way, and that wealth had attracted saloons and general stores and a sheriff who was mostly honest and a population of men who were mostly not. It was not a place a 23-year-old woman from Cincinnati arrived by choice. But Elara Voss had made the particular mistake of marrying a man who turned out to be a liar, and the law of Ohio had not yet caught up to the idea that a woman could simply leave such a man without consequence. So she had left anyway, and Caldwell, Kansas, was where her money had run out. She stood on the main street with the afternoon sun pressing down like a hot iron on the back of her neck, and looked around at the wooden storefronts and the men on horseback and the women in bonnets moving with purpose between the milliner and the dry goods store, and she thought, very clearly and without drama, that she was completely alone. You planning on standing there until sundown, or are you going to move out of the street before you get trampled? She turned. The voice belonged to a man leaning against the post of the general store, his arms crossed, his expression not unkind but not particularly warm either. He was tall and broad-shouldered with a face that had been out in the sun too long, and a cowboy hat, brown and broken in around the brim, that he wore with the easy authority of someone who had been wearing hats like it since he was old enough to be trusted with one. He looked to be somewhere in his late 20s, maybe 28 or 29, with dark eyes and a jaw that needed shaving and hands that looked like they had done real work in real weather. I was taking stock of the situation, Elara said, because she had found in recent months that the best response to condescension was precision. He raised an eyebrow. How's the situation looking? Insufficient, she said. Something shifted in his expression, though she could not quite name what it was. Not amusement exactly, more like recognition. Name's Holt Callaway, he said, pushing off from the post and walking toward her with the unhurried gait of a man who was comfortable in his own boots. He stopped a polite distance away and touched the brim of his hat. You just come in on the Wichita stage. I did. You got somewhere to be. Not yet, she said, which was the truest thing she had said all day. He studied her for a moment with those dark eyes, and she got the uncomfortable sense that he was reading something in her face that she had not meant to leave visible. Mrs. Aldridge runs a boarding house 2 streets over, he said finally. She's a decent woman, fair rates, and she doesn't ask questions that aren't her business if you're looking for a place to start. That's very helpful, Elara said. Thank you. He nodded once, touched his hat again, and stepped back. Welcome to Caldwell, Miss Voss, she said. Elara Voss. Miss Voss. And then he walked back toward the general store and went inside, and Elara picked up her satchel and found the boarding house and rented the smallest room they had for the smallest price, and lay down on the narrow bed in the fading afternoon light and tried very hard not to cry. She succeeded mostly. Mrs. Aldridge was indeed a decent woman, stout and practical. With gray-streaked hair she kept pinned back so firmly it seemed defiant. She ran her house with the brisk efficiency of someone who had long ago decided that kindness and sentimentality were different things, and that only one of them was truly useful. She found Elara work within a week, bookkeeping at the dry goods store owned by a man named Fletcher, whose sums were always wrong and whose frustration at that fact was considerable. You can count, Fletcher had said when Mrs. Aldridge had presented Elara to him. I can count, I can keep ledgers, and I can tell you within 20 minutes where you're losing money, Elara had said, and Fletcher had hired her on the spot because he was losing money and he had been suspicious of it for months. She was good at the work. She had always been good at numbers, and the quiet precision required to balance accounts suited something deep in her nature, a need for things to add up, for causes to have effects, for the world to behave in ways that made logical sense. It was, she sometimes thought, why marriage to Arthur Voss had been so devastating, not the cruelty of it, which had been modest by certain standards, but the irrationality of it, the way the numbers simply had not added up no matter how she rearranged them. She did not think about Arthur very much after the first month. Caldwell was too loud and too immediate for that kind of backward thinking. The cattle drives were beginning to come through in earnest as May arrived, and the town swelled with cowboys fresh off the trail, dusty and paid, and looking for something to spend their earnings on. The streets grew louder. The saloon across from Fletcher's store never seemed to close. Mrs. Aldridge took in 3 more boarders and started locking the front door at 9 o'clock precisely. Elara saw Holt Callaway again on a Tuesday morning in early June, when she was walking to Fletcher's store with a stack of receipts she had taken home to sort, and he was coming out of the hardware store with a coil of rope over one shoulder and a look on his face like he was thinking about 3 things at once. He stopped when he saw her. "Miss Voss." "Mr. Callaway." "You're still here," he said, and it came out with a note of something that was not quite surprise. "I am," she agreed. "I'm keeping accounts at Fletcher's store." "That's so." He shifted the rope on his shoulder. "Fletcher's a good man. Bad at numbers, though." "Terrible at them," she said, and he laughed, low and genuine, and it was such an unexpected sound that she found herself smiling before she had decided to. They stood there a moment in the morning light with the street busy around them, and then she said, "I should get to work," and he nodded and said, "Of course," and they parted, and she did not think about the way he had laughed for the rest of the day, except that she did, a little in between the receipts. He came into Fletcher's store that same afternoon to buy a new jackknife, and he lingered at the counter longer than the transaction strictly required, asking about prices on horseshoe nails and making observations about the weather that summer, which everyone agreed was going to be fierce. She answered him from behind the counter with the ledger open in front of her, and she was aware, in a very controlled and businesslike way, that she was glad he was there. He left and came back the next week, and the week after that. Not every time with a reason that convinced her entirely, though she kept that observation to herself. He bought enough hardware and dry goods over the course of June to equip a small army, but she noticed that he mostly asked questions and listened to her answers with a quality of attention that was rare in her experience, real attention, the kind that meant the words were actually landing somewhere. She learned things about him in pieces, the way you learn a landscape by walking through it slowly. He ran a cattle ranch about 12 miles outside of town, a decent-sized operation he had built from almost nothing over the previous 5 years. He had 2 hired hands named Dex and Charlie, who he spoke of with affectionate exasperation. He had come to Kansas from Texas at the age of 23, which made him 28 now, and the reasons for that journey he did not volunteer and she did not press. He was not much for saloons. He read when he could get books, which was not often enough. His horse was named Patience, which she thought said something about him, though she could not immediately say what. She told him things too, carefully at first and then less carefully as the summer wore on. About Cincinnati, about the work she had done there in her uncle's accounting firm, about the particular loneliness of being a woman who was good at things that the world around her had decided were not meant for women. She did not tell him about Arthur. Not yet. Some things needed more time than 6 weeks to speak aloud. In July, a situation arose that required more of Elara than she had planned to give to the town of Caldwell. A woman named Rosa Garza had been working at the boarding house as a laundress for 3 years, and she was efficient and quiet, and Mrs. Aldridge valued her work. But Rosa had a brother named Miguel, who had gotten himself into trouble with a man named Cutter, who ran a rough kind of operation on the south end of town that involved card games and debts that grew faster than a person could pay them. Miguel owed Cutter $40, which was a significant sum, and Cutter's response to significant sums owed to him was not patient. Rosa had come to Elara because Elara had numbers, and Rosa had heard that Elara was good at finding money where other people saw none. "He does not have $40, Rosa said, sitting across from Elara in the small parlor of the boarding house on a Sunday afternoon. "He has maybe 12, and Cutter's men came to his house yesterday." Elara had looked at the situation from several angles and concluded that the direct approach was the only one that made arithmetic sense. She went to the bank and spoke with the manager, a man named Hargrove, who was not particularly inclined to extend credit to a Mexican laborer he did not know. She spent 45 minutes presenting Miguel Garza's case with the methodical clarity she brought to every ledger, and at the end of it, Hargrove had agreed to a short-term loan at terms that were not generous but were survivable. The problem was that Cutter also needed to be spoken to, and that was not a conversation she could manage alone. She did not plan to ask Holt Callaway for help. She went to the sheriff first, who told her that Cutter had not technically broken any laws and that debt collection, however unpleasant, was not his jurisdiction. She went back to the sheriff's office and argued that point, and the sheriff told her the same thing again, slightly louder. And then she walked out of the office and ran directly into Holt Callaway, who caught her by the shoulders when she stumbled on the step and then looked at her face and said, "What happened?" she told him. She had not planned to, but the anger was pressing against her chest and the words came out in a flat, controlled rush. And when she was finished, he was quiet for a moment, looking out at the street. "I know Cutter," he said. "Everyone seems to know Cutter. Not the way I mean," he looked at her. "He owes me a favor, an old one, the kind he'd rather settle than have hanging over him." "You would do that?" she asked. "For someone you don't know?" "I know you," he said, and then he seemed to hear how that had sounded and he looked away briefly, the brim of his hat hiding his expression. "And what he's doing to that family isn't right." He went to see Cutter that evening. She did not go with him, though she had offered to, and he had declined with a firmness that she recognized as protective, which she found irritating and also, quietly, not entirely unwelcome. The next morning, Rosa told her that Cutter had agreed to accept the loan payment and consider the debt cleared. Elara went to Fletcher's store that Tuesday, and when Holt came in, as he did, she said, "Thank you. What you did for the Garza family, it mattered." He shrugged, that particular way he had of deflecting acknowledgement, like a man not entirely sure what to do when kindness was directed back at him. "It was the right thing." "Many right things don't get done," she said. "You did this one." He looked at her for a moment, and in the afternoon light coming through the store window his eyes were very dark and very direct, and she felt something shift in the space between them, something that had been building for weeks and that she was not quite ready to name. "Miss Voss," he said, quietly enough that Fletcher, who was in the back sorting cans, could not hear, "would you do me the honor of taking supper with me on Saturday?" She was quiet for exactly one breath. "Yes," she said, "I would." They had supper at the hotel dining room, which was the best restaurant in Caldwell, and operated with a formality that was slightly absurd given that the town's primary industry was moving cattle from one place to another, but which she appreciated on that particular evening, because the formality gave them both something to navigate together, which was a kind of intimacy in itself. They sat across from each other with candles between them and the noise of the street muffled by the walls, and they talked for 3 hours. She told him about Arthur. She had not planned to tell him about Arthur, but the conversation had moved in that direction the way rivers move around obstacles, naturally and without asking permission. She told him about the marriage and the realization, slow and terrible as all true realizations are, that the man she had married was not the man she had believed him to be, that he had debts she had not known about, and a temper that came out sideways, and a fundamental dishonesty that went all the way down to the bone, that she had stayed longer than she should have because leaving required a courage she had been building slowly, like a person building a fire in the wind. Holt listened to all of it without interrupting or offering opinions she had not asked for. When she was finished, he was quiet for a moment and then he said, "Are you safe? Is he going to come looking for you?" "I don't think so," she said. "I think he's relieved I'm gone. It was the idea of me leaving that he couldn't tolerate. The fact of it, I think, suits him fine." "All right," he said, and she could hear that he had filed the information carefully, had taken it seriously without making it catastrophic, and she appreciated that more than she could immediately express. "Your turn," she said. "Why did you leave Texas?" He was quiet for a moment, turning his water glass in his hands. Then he said, "My father's ranch. I was supposed to inherit it. My older brother thought otherwise, and he had a talent for convincing our father of things. By the time my father died, the paperwork said the land was my brother's." He paused. "I could have fought it. I thought about fighting it for about a year. And then I decided I'd rather build something of my own than spend my life trying to reclaim something that someone else wanted to take." "And did you," she asked, "build something of your own?" "I'm still building," he said. And the way he looked at her when he said it made her heart do something complicated and unexpected that she decided not to analyze immediately. They walked back through the warm summer night, and when they reached the boarding house he stopped at the gate and held it open for her, and she turned to thank him and found him closer than she had expected, close enough that she could see the particular quality of his attention when it was fully directed at her, and it was the most seen she had felt in a very long time. "Good night, Miss Voss," he said. "Good night, Mr. Callaway," she said. And then, because she was who she was, "Elara, please." Something happened to his expression then, warm and quiet and quick like sunlight on water. "Good night, Elara. Good night, Holt." She went inside and went upstairs and sat on the edge of her narrow bed and thought, very carefully, about whether she was being an absolute fool. She concluded that she might be, but that it was the kind of foolishness that at least had the dignity of being honest. August arrived the way it always did in Kansas, without mercy and without apology. The heat was ferocious, and the dust was constant, and the cattle drives that came through were louder and more chaotic than anything Elara had imagined, having grown up in the relative orderliness of Cincinnati. She got used to it, the way you get used to things when you have no other choice, and found that once you got used to it there was something almost beautiful about the scale of it. The horses and the men and the cattle moving through the plains like something elemental and untamable. She and Holt had supper together most Saturday evenings, and sometimes on Wednesdays when he came into town for supplies, and once on a Sunday afternoon he took her out to see the ranch, which surprised her in the way that things sometimes do when they turn out to be better than described. It was a working ranch in the proper sense, functional and spare, with a solid two-room house that he had built himself and a barn that was the nicest structure on the property, and probably reflected his priorities accurately. There were horses in the paddock and chickens somewhere out of sight, and the two hired hands, Dex and Charlie, who turned out to be a pair of men somewhere in their 40s who regarded Elara with the careful neutrality of people trying very hard not to have visible opinions. "It's beautiful," she said, standing on the porch of the house and looking out at the flat country rolling away to the south, the grass golden in the afternoon light. "It'll be better," he said, with that same quality she had heard at the hotel, that quiet reaching toward something not yet finished. "The south pasture needs fencing, and I want to add a room to the house before winter, and the well needs—" He stopped. "Sorry, you didn't come out here for a list of problems." "I like lists," she said, which was true. "Tell me about the south pasture." He told her about the south pasture. And then she asked a question about the fencing costs, and he answered it. And somehow within 20 minutes they were sitting on the porch steps, going through the economics of the ranch, with the engaged practicality of two people who both enjoyed the particular pleasure of problems that had solutions. And when she looked up from the figures she had been working out in the dirt with a stick, and found him watching her with a look that made her breath catch, she understood that something had crossed a threshold without her being entirely aware of when. "Holt," she said. "I know," he said very quietly. They looked at each other for a long moment in the late afternoon light, and then she looked back at the numbers in the dirt and said, If you moved the fencing operation to September, the cost would drop by about a third because the demand for labor goes down after the drives end. He was quiet for a moment. Then, equally quietly, "Thank you. That's good thinking." She stood up and brushed the dust off her skirt, and they walked back to town in the long golden evening light, close enough that their hands nearly touched, and neither of them quite closed that distance, but neither of them moved away from it either. She was lying awake in the small hours of a September morning when she heard a sound from the street that she identified, after a moment of alertness, as raised voices, and then a scuffle, and then the particular crash of a man going through a door. She went to her window and saw, in the lamplight from the saloon across the street, a man sprawled in the dust who was being encouraged to stay there by two other men who worked for Cutter. She watched long enough to determine that the situation was not going to escalate further that night, and then she went back to bed and lay there thinking about Cutter, and about Caldwell, and about the degree to which she had come to think of this raw and improbable town as something approaching home. That was the moment, she realized later, when she understood that she was staying. Not as a temporary arrangement, not as a place where her money had run out, but as a place she had chosen, with the kind of choosing that is deliberate and clear-eyed and not a little brave. She did not tell Holt about this decision immediately. She was still working out what it meant and what she wanted it to mean, which were two slightly different questions. In October, a letter arrived from Cincinnati. It was from her Uncle Robert, her mother's brother, who was the only member of her family with whom she had maintained any correspondence since leaving. He wrote to tell her that Arthur Voss had filed for divorce on the grounds of abandonment, and that under Ohio law, the divorce would be finalized in the spring of 1880, which was 6 months away. He wrote also to say that he thought she had been right to leave, and that her mother, who had not spoken to her since the departure, was beginning to show signs of reconsidering that position. Elara read the letter twice, folded it carefully, and went back to work. She told Holt about it on their next Saturday evening, not in a heavy or dramatic way, but matter-of-factly, as a piece of information that changed the geometry of her situation. He was quiet for a long moment after she told him. 6 months, he said, about that. He nodded very slowly, the way he nodded when he was thinking through something carefully. That's not so long, he said. No, she agreed. Not so long. They looked at each other across the table, and there was something in the air between them that had the particular quality of a word not yet spoken, something that both of them knew was there, and that neither of them was quite ready to give voice to yet. Not because they were afraid of it, she thought, but because they had both learned, in different ways and through different costs, to be careful with important things. November came in cold and hard, and Caldwell buttoned up against the winter with the pragmatic efficiency of a frontier town that had been through this before. Elara bought a better coat from the dry goods store, charging it against her wages with Fletcher's cheerful agreement, and she started keeping the ledgers at the boarding house as well as at the store, which gave her a bit more income and also gave Mrs. Aldridge someone to play cards with on the long winter evenings. Holt came into town less frequently as the winter settled in, the ranch demanding more of his attention during the cold months, and she felt his absence with a clarity that was itself informative. She thought about him in the evenings and in the mornings and sometimes in the middles of days, in a way that had stopped feeling surprising and had simply become a quality of her daily landscape, like the cold or the wind or the particular smell of wood smoke that hung over the town when the temperature dropped. He came in for Christmas, bringing a small gift wrapped in brown paper that turned out to be a book, a collection of essays by an author she had mentioned once, in passing, weeks ago, and she looked at the book and looked at him and thought, quite clearly, that this man had been paying attention to her in a way that she was going to have to do something about eventually. "How did you find this?" she asked, Wrote to a bookseller in Kansas City, he said, with the careful casualness of someone who has done a considerable amount of work and does not want to make a production of it. Holt. It's Christmas, he said, which was not quite an answer. She looked at him for a long moment. They were standing in the parlor of the boarding house, Mrs. Aldridge tactfully elsewhere, the smell of pine boughs and wood smoke in the air, and the winter light coming through the windows in the pale, flat way that winter light had. "I have something for you too," she said, and went to her room and came back with the thing she had been making for 2 weeks, which was a detailed set of account books for the ranch, properly organized and labeled, with a system for tracking costs and income that would save him considerable time and frustration. He looked at the account books for a long moment and then looked at her, and the expression on his face was so warm and so direct that she had to look away briefly. "Nobody's ever given me something like this," he said. "Practical gifts are underrated," she said, a little unsteadily. He laughed, that low, genuine laugh, and then they sat down and had Christmas supper with Mrs. Aldridge and 2 of the other boarders, and the evening was warm and simple, and she thought, going to bed that night, that she was happy. It was not a feeling she had experienced with great frequency in the past several years, and she recognized it with the careful attention you give to rare things. January of 1880 was brutal. A blizzard came through in the middle of the month that shut Caldwell down for 4 days. And for those 4 days Elara sat by the window of the boarding house and worked on the accounts and read and played cards with Mrs. Aldridge, and tried not to think about whether the ranch was all right, whether Holt and Dex and Charlie were managing the cattle through the storm. He rode into town on the 5th day, when the storm had cleared and the snow lay 3 feet deep on the flat country, and the sky was the particular dazzling blue that only appears after a blizzard. He came to the boarding house before he went anywhere else, which she would think about later, and she opened the door to him, and he stood there on the porch with snow on his hat and frost on his collar, and he said, "We're all right. Lost 2 cattle, but the hands are fine and the house held." "I wasn't worried," she said, and then, because she had always been a person who valued accuracy, "That's not true, I was worried." "I know," he said. He came inside and Mrs. Aldridge gave him coffee, and he sat at the kitchen table and they talked for 2 hours about the storm and the winter and the state of the ranch and about a dozen other things, and when he finally rose to leave she walked him to the door and he stood there with his hat in his hands, turning it slowly by the brim. "Elara," he said. "Yes." He looked at the hat for a moment, then looked at her. "I know the timing isn't," he paused, organizing the words. "The divorce won't be final until spring. I know that. And I'm not trying to rush anything or put you in a position." He stopped again. "I'm not saying this well." "You're saying it fine," she said quietly. He looked at her. "I just want you to know that I'm here, whatever happens. Whether you decide Caldwell is where you want to be or whether you decide it isn't, I'm not going anywhere." She looked at him for a long moment in the winter light. "Holt," she said, "I decided Caldwell is where I want to be 2 months ago." He was very still for a moment. "I wasn't sure of a great many things when I arrived here," she continued, "but I am sure of that, and I am increasingly sure of a few other things as well." She held his gaze. "I think you know what those things are." "I think I do," he said very quietly. "Good," she said. "Then neither of us has to guess." He put his hat on, and then he took it off again, which made her smile, and he said, "Would you?" "Yes," she said before he had finished the question. He smiled then, really smiled, and it changed the whole shape of his face, and she thought that this was a face she wanted to keep looking at for a very long time. Spring arrived with its typical Kansas extravagance, loud and warm and full of possibility. The letter from her uncle arrived in April confirming that the divorce had been finalized, and Elara read it at the kitchen table of the boarding house and felt not grief but something cleaner. A door closing on a room that had been dark, a window opening somewhere else. She and Holt had been walking out together openly since February, which in Caldwell in 1880 was sufficient to constitute a formal understanding, and the people who knew them both approved of it in the mostly unspoken way that communities have of registering approval, which manifested primarily as Fletcher giving Holt better prices on nails, and Mrs. Aldridge setting 2 places at the kitchen table without being asked when Holt came for supper. It was a warm April evening, the windows of the boarding house open for the first time since October, when Holt asked her to marry him. He did it without ceremony, which suited them both. They were sitting on the back porch after supper, and he said, "Elara, I would very much like to marry you if you'll have me." She looked at him in the soft evening light, this man who had stopped a stranger from standing in the road and been kind about it, who had used an old favor to help a family he had no obligation to, who had written to Kansas City for a book she had mentioned once, who had come to the boarding house after the blizzard before he went anywhere else. "Yes," she said, "I'll have you." He exhaled, like a man releasing something he had been holding carefully for a long time, and then he reached across and took her hand, and they sat there in the warm spring evening with their hands together, and the sound of Caldwell settling into its nighttime rhythms around them. They were married in June of 1880, on a bright morning that had the quality of something earned. The ceremony was conducted by the town's Methodist minister in the small white church at the north end of Main Street, with Mrs. Aldridge and Rosa Garza and Fletcher and Dex and Charlie, and about 30 other people who had found their way into Elara's life over the past year in attendance. Elara wore a blue dress she had made herself from fabric she and Rosa had chosen together, and Holt wore a clean shirt and his good hat, which he removed when they entered the church and held in his hands throughout the ceremony with a reverence that she found unexpectedly moving. When the minister said the words and Holt put the ring on her finger, a simple gold band he had ordered from a jeweler in Wichita, she felt the weight of it with something that was not quite surprise but was close to it, the way you feel the weight of things that matter. They had the reception in the yard behind the boarding house, with food that Mrs. Aldridge had organized with military precision and music from a fiddle player named Tom, who played with more enthusiasm than skill, but made up for it in volume. Rosa danced with her brother Miguel, who had paid off the bank loan 3 months early and was employed now at the livery stable. Fletcher gave a toast that was mostly about how much better his accounts looked since Elara's arrival, which everyone agreed was true. Charlie and Dex managed to get themselves into a friendly argument about something entirely unrelated to the occasion, and had to be separated by the general amusement of the crowd. Holt danced with her when the sun was going down, and the fireflies were beginning to flicker in the tall grass at the edge of the yard, and he was not a particularly skilled dancer, but he was attentive in the way he was attentive to everything, and she rested her head briefly against his shoulder and felt, with an entirety that surprised her, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. They moved to the ranch after the wedding, Elara's few possessions fitting easily into the wagon Holt had brought to town. She set up the kitchen the way she wanted it and put her books on the shelf Holt built for her in the sitting room, and established a small desk near the window where the morning light fell best, because she had agreed to continue keeping the books for Fletcher's store, which she could do remotely, and come into town once a week to deliver accounts and pick up new receipts. The ranch house was small but solid, and she found herself looking at it the way she had looked at difficult ledgers, seeing not what was missing but what was there, the foundation of something that could be built upon. That first summer of their marriage was one of the best she could remember. They worked hard, both of them, and the work had the particular satisfaction of building something together, of each person's effort compounding with the others. She expanded her accounting work to include 2 other businesses in town, the hotel and the livery stable, and the income from this meant they could begin the expansion of the house that Holt had been planning, adding 2 more rooms to the east side of the building. She learned to ride that summer. Holt taught her on a horse named Molasses, who was as calm and good-natured as her name suggested, and the lessons were one of the pleasures of that season, the 2 of them out in the early morning light with the prairie stretching out in every direction, and Holt's voice patient and clear, and her own slowly growing confidence as she found her balance and her seat. "You're a natural," he told her one morning, after she had managed a controlled canter along the fence line for the first time. "I'm adequate," she said, pulling up beside him. "Natural would be faster," he grinned. "You've been at this 3 weeks. I know, I'm impatient." "I know," he said, and the warmth in it made her want to reach out and touch his face, which she did briefly, gloved hand against his jaw, and he turned his face slightly into it in the way she had come to recognize and love. In September of 1880, she told him she was pregnant. She told him in the morning over coffee with the direct practicality that was her way. She said, "I believe we are going to have a child," and watched his face. What happened to his face in the next 10 seconds was something she would try to describe to Rosa later and largely fail, because it was not a single expression but a sequence of them: surprise and wonder, and a kind of ferocious tenderness, and something that looked very much like fear, not the cowardly kind but the kind that comes with understanding how much something matters. He got up from the table and came around to her and took both her hands in his and said, "Are you all right?" "I'm perfectly well," she said. "Are you?" "I will be," he said, which was honest, and she loved him for it. He was extraordinary throughout the pregnancy, attentive without being suffocating, practical in his worry, finding ways to help that did not require acknowledging that she needed help, because he understood her well enough by then to know that direct offers of assistance made her bristle and indirect ones she accepted with equanimity. He took over the heavier work of the house without comment. He made sure the path between the house and the barn was cleared and level. He drove her into town for her accounts work every week and sat in the wagon reading. He had found a source for books through the general store and read with the enthusiasm of a person who had been somewhat starved for them, while she conducted her business. They argued sometimes. They were two people with strong opinions and clear ideas about how things should be done, and occasionally those opinions collided. They argued about whether to buy a second milk cow, which Elara thought was an unnecessary expense and Holt thought was practical. And in the end they bought the cow, and Elara admitted that the milk production was helpful. They argued about the route of the new fence, and they compromised in a way that turned out to be better than either of their original positions. They argued once, sharply and seriously, about a decision Holt had made regarding a contract for cattle that he had not consulted her on, and that argument lasted 2 days and ended with a real conversation about partnership and what it meant and required, and they were stronger on the other side of it. The baby came in late May of 1881, in the room that had been added to the east side of the house, with Mrs. Aldridge in attendance, who turned out to have considerable experience with deliveries, and it was a boy, healthy and loud, with a ferocious amount of dark hair that made Dex, who was allowed a brief look through the doorway, say that he looked like a small and irritable professor. They named him James Robert Callaway James for no particular reason, except that it suited him, and Robert for Elara's uncle, who had written them a letter of such warmth and genuine happiness when he heard of the marriage that she had kept it in the desk drawer. Holt held James for the first time with the careful, focused attention he brought to things that required precision and care, and Elara, tired and content and leaning against the pillows, watched him and felt such a profound wash of love for both of them that she had to close her eyes for a moment. "He's extraordinary," Holt said, very quietly, not looking up from the baby. "He is," she agreed. "He has your brow. He has your chin and your expression. He's a day old. He doesn't have expressions yet. This one he does." Holt looked up then, and his eyes were bright in a way she had not seen before, not sadness but something related to it, the edge of wonder. "Elara, thank you." "We did that together," she said. "Yes," he said. "We did." The summer of 1881 was full in the way that summers with a new baby are full, which is to say that it contained very little rest and a great deal of intensity and occasional moments of such simple beauty. James's first real smile, his grip around Holt's finger, the way he turned his head toward Elara's voice, that the tiredness was worth it in a way that was beyond calculation. Rosa came out to the ranch to help several times a week, and she and Elara had developed the kind of friendship that is built on practical closeness and mutual respect, and which had become one of the steadier things in Elara's life. Rosa was sharp and funny and had strong opinions about most things, and she was now being courted by a quiet carpenter named Samuel who had come to Caldwell the previous year and built things with a precision that Elara appreciated, and Rosa clearly did too. Fletcher retired from the dry goods store in the fall of 1881, selling it to a young man named Harris from Wichita, and in the transition, Elara found herself with an expanded role in the business, as Harris quickly discovered that the store's smooth operation had everything to do with its accounting and not much to do with his own instincts, which were enthusiastic but erratic. She took on a formal partnership arrangement, a small percentage of the profits in exchange for ongoing management of the financial side of the operation, and it was the first time she had been offered an ownership stake in anything, and she accepted it with the calm outward manner of a person who is being very controlled about something that matters to her considerably. Holt celebrated this by buying her a new desk, a real one, oak, with proper drawers, which arrived from Wichita in a wagon and required 3 men to get into the house. She ran her hand over the surface of it and thought about all the surfaces she had worked at over the years: the kitchen table in Cincinnati, the back counter at Fletcher's old store, the narrow desk in the boarding house room, and this one was hers in a way none of the others had been, and she thought she understood, now, what Holt had meant when he said he wanted to build something of his own. James took his first steps in December of 1881, on the kitchen floor, while Holt was watching with an expression of concentrated hope, and Elara was pretending not to watch from behind a ledger book. He made it 4 steps and then sat down hard on the floor and looked up at them both with the expression of someone who is satisfied with the result of an experiment. By the spring of 1882, the ranch had grown. Holt had acquired an additional section of land to the south. The fencing Elara had advised moving to September had saved them considerably, and the herd was up to a size that had them looking at one of the larger cattle drives with serious intent. Dex and Charlie had been joined by 2 new hands, a young man named Pedro and an older one named Marsh, and the operation had the quality of a functioning thing, a system with enough parts that each one mattered. She was keeping the accounts for 4 businesses in Caldwell by then, and had hired a girl named Alice, 17 and sharp as a new blade, as an apprentice, teaching her the bookkeeping skills that Elara had spent years accumulating. Alice was going to be very good at this, and Elara found that teaching her was one of the more satisfying things she did, passing something useful along to someone who would use it well. In June of 1882, on the 2nd anniversary of their wedding, Holt rode into town while Elara was at the store with James, who at 13 months was an entity of considerable mobility and ambition and required consistent supervision. She was attempting to finish a column of figures while James made determined efforts to reach the counter above him, and she heard Holt's boots on the floor and did not look up because she was 2 lines from the end of the column. "Give me 1 moment," she said. "Take your time," he said, and there was something in his voice that made her finish the column faster. She looked up. He was standing in the middle of the store with his hat in his hands and a small wooden box, and James, spotting his father, made the vigorous sound that served as his current version of his name, and lifted both arms in the unmistakable gesture of a child demanding to be picked up. Holt scooped him up with the ease of practice, and James grabbed his hat, also with the ease of practice, and Holt let him have it, which meant the hat ended up on the floor, and James was enormously pleased with himself. "Happy anniversary," Holt said. He held out the wooden box. She opened it. Inside, on a small square of velvet, was a brooch, small and not elaborate, a simple silver circle with a tiny stone that was, she realized after a moment, the same blue as the dress she had worn on their wedding day. "Holt," she said softly, "I've been looking for the right thing for a while," he said. "I saw that in a shop in Wichita on the cattle run." She looked at it for a long moment and then looked at him, with James examining the top button of his shirt with great seriousness between them, and she thought of the year and a half she had spent in Caldwell before their marriage, and all the evenings at the hotel dining room, and the Christmas book, and the way he had come to the boarding house after the blizzard before he went anywhere else. "You know," she said, "I have been thinking about something Rosa said to me last week." "What did Rosa say?" "She was talking about how she and Samuel met, and she said—" Elara paused, organizing the thought. "She said it was remarkable to her that he had come to Caldwell at the time he did, because if he had come a year earlier she would not have been ready to see him properly." Holt was quiet, watching her. "I thought about that," Elara said. "About timing. About the fact that I arrived here in May of 1879 and met you that same afternoon. That if I had arrived earlier or later or chosen differently when my money ran out." She stopped. "I am not someone who believes much in fate. I believe in choices and their consequences. But I find myself grateful, very specifically and very deeply, for the sequence of choices that brought me to this particular street at this particular time." "So do I," he said very quietly. James had found the collar of Holt's shirt and was tugging it with editorial purpose. Holt adjusted his hold on the boy without looking away from Elara. "I love you," she said. She did not say it as much as she showed it, which was something she was working on, and this seemed like the right occasion to say it plainly. "I love you," he said, equally plainly, with the direct economy that was his way. They looked at each other over James's head in the dusty warmth of the dry goods store, and it was entirely uncinematic and exactly right. That fall, something happened that Elara had not anticipated, and which initially presented itself as a problem and resolved itself, eventually, as an opportunity. A woman arrived in Caldwell from the East, a journalist from a publication in St. Louis who was doing a series of articles about Western towns and their commerce. Her name was Ida Marsh, no relation to the ranch hand, and she was competent and observant and very interested in the economic structures of frontier communities. She came to the store to talk to Harris, and Harris, who was a man of genuine good nature and honest enough about his limitations, introduced her to Elara as the person who actually understood how the economics worked. Ida Marsh spent 3 days talking to Elara. She was interested in everything: how the accounts were structured, how credit worked in a frontier community, how the circulation of money between the cattle drives and the town businesses functioned, what the particular pressures and opportunities were for commerce in a place like Caldwell. She was also interested in Elara herself, in the fact of a woman running multiple business accounts in a cattle town in 1882, and she asked about that directly and with the frankness that Elara found refreshing. "You're notable," Ida said on the 3rd day over coffee in the hotel. "I don't mean that condescendingly. I mean that what you're doing here is unusual and it's worth writing about." "It doesn't feel unusual," Elara said. "It feels like using skills I have in ways that are useful." "And that is exactly what makes it notable," Ida said. "Because the assumption is that you shouldn't be able to, or shouldn't want to, and you simply proceeded as if that assumption were irrelevant." "It is irrelevant," Elara said. "Yes," Ida said, "but not everyone knows that yet." The article appeared in the St. Louis paper in November, and a copy of it arrived in Caldwell via the mail the following month. It was a long and thoughtful piece about Western commerce, and Elara appeared in it prominently, described with accuracy and respect. Fletcher, retired now and living in a small house on the edge of town with his wife, read the article and came to find Elara at the ranch specifically to tell her that it was exactly right and that he was proud to have been the first person to employ her. "You were skeptical at first," she reminded him. "I was an old fool," he said cheerfully. "Then you showed me where I was losing $12 a month on grain and I reformed." Rosa married Samuel in the spring of 1883, a quiet ceremony in the Catholic tradition that Elara and Holt attended with James, now nearly 2 and a source of continuous motion. Rosa was radiantly happy in the specific way of people who have found something they had not been certain existed, and Samuel looked at her with the expression of a man who is still slightly disbelieving his own good fortune. At the reception held in the yard of Samuel's carpentry shop, Rosa pulled Elara aside and said, "Are you thinking of having another baby?" "I am thinking about it," Elara admitted. "Good," Rosa said. "James needs someone to argue with. He has too much of you in him to do well as an only child." Elara told Holt about this conversation that evening, driving home in the wagon with James asleep between them, and Holt laughed and said, "Rosa isn't wrong." "She rarely is," Elara agreed. She did tell him on their own that she wanted another child, and he said that he wanted that too, and they looked at each other in the particular private way they had developed over 3 years of marriage, a kind of shorthand that had its own grammar, and that was essentially the whole conversation. Their daughter was born in January of 1884, in the same room where James had arrived, again with Mrs. Aldridge presiding, again loud and healthy, and with an amount of hair that was apparently a family trait. They named her Clara, which was Holt's mother's name, which surprised Elara because he had not often spoken of his family, and when she looked at him after suggesting and agreeing to it, she saw something careful and grateful in his face. James, who was now 2.5 and a person of considerable personality, approached Clara's arrival with the analytical suspicion of someone who has been the center of attention and is reassessing the new arrangement. He spent the first week regarding his sister with the focused attention of a scientist examining a potentially unstable compound, and then somewhere in the second week, he apparently decided she was acceptable, because he brought her a wooden spoon from the kitchen, which was his most prized possession, and placed it beside her with the ceremony of a formal gift. Clara, who was 9 days old and had no use for wooden spoons, did not respond, but everyone else in the room found it so affecting that the moment was spoken of for years afterward. The ranch continued to grow through 1884 and into 1885. Holt made his first large cattle run to Wichita in the summer of 1884 with Dex and Pedro and Marsh, and came back sunburned and tired and with enough money to pay off the last of the land debt, which he told Elara about by placing the paid-off deed on her oak desk without comment, because he knew she would understand exactly what it meant. She understood exactly what it meant. "We own it," she said, looking at the document. "All of it," he said. "Clean." She looked at the deed for a moment longer, and then she stood up and walked over to him and put her arms around him, which she did when she meant something completely and did not have words large enough for it, and he held her in that way he had, like she was both precious and substantial, and outside the window the Kansas summer pressed on in all its relentless heat and beauty. In the fall of 1885, Elara's mother came to visit. This had been preceded by a 1.5 years of letters, a slow, careful reconstruction of a relationship that had been seriously damaged by the collision of her mother's sense of propriety with Elara's decision to leave Arthur. Her mother was not a bad woman. She was a woman of her time and her upbringing, and those things had led her to positions that Elara understood, if not always agreed with. The letters had begun with formality and progressed to warmth, and when her mother wrote in the spring to ask if she might come west, Elara had said yes. Her mother arrived on the Wichita stage the same road, Elara thought, standing at the station, by which she herself had arrived 6 years earlier with a satchel and a determination she had not yet fully understood. Her mother was smaller than she remembered, or perhaps Elara was simply larger in the ways that mattered, and she looked around at Caldwell with the expression of someone encountering something entirely outside their frame of reference. "My goodness," her mother said, taking in the street. "It is quite real," Elara said. "I was going to say active. That too." Holt met her mother that evening at the ranch, shaking her hand with the same direct and unfussy courtesy he brought to every introduction, and he showed her around the property with the patient thoroughness of someone who takes pride in their work and is not anxious about it. Her mother watched him. Elara could see her watching him, and what she was reading and what she saw was slowly changing the expression on her face from cautious assessment to something warmer. At supper, James, who was 4 3/4 and conducting a relentless investigation of all adults who entered his life, sat beside his grandmother and asked her approximately 40 questions about Cincinnati, about the steamboats, about what Elara had been like as a child. Her mother answered all of them with a delight that was real and unguarded, and Clara, who was nearly 2 and regarded strangers with an unsettling directness that she had apparently inherited from both parents, eventually climbed into her grandmother's lap and fell asleep there, which sealed things entirely. Her mother stayed for 3 weeks. She and Elara had the conversations that needed to be had, not all at once and not without difficulty, but honestly and with the particular tenderness that comes between people who have hurt each other and have both decided that the future matters more than the accounting of old wounds. On her last evening, sitting on the porch of the ranch house with the sunset painting the flat country in shades of orange and gold, her mother looked out at the land and said, "I didn't understand what you were doing when you left. I thought you were making a terrible mistake." "I know," Elara said. "I was wrong," her mother said, simply and directly, which was how she communicated when she was being entirely serious. "This is a good life, Elara. You built a good life." "We built it," Elara said. Her mother looked at her. "Yes," she said, "you did," and then after a moment, "He's a good man." "He is," Elara said, "the best I've met." Her mother went back to Cincinnati with a promise to come again in the spring, and she was as good as her promise. The years settled into themselves with the comfortable depth of things that have found their proper form. Caldwell changed around them. It was changing for all Western towns in the middle of the 1880s, the cattle drive shifting routes, the railroad bringing new commerce and new people, the raw frontier quality softening, not entirely but perceptibly. New businesses arrived. A proper school opened at the north end of town, which was of immediate relevance to James, who started in the fall of 1886 and who, within the first month, had organized the other students on the question of the school's arithmetic lessons, which he felt were proceeding too slowly. "He told the teacher," Holt said when Elara reported this. "He did," she said. "What did the teacher say?" "That James was right, which I thought was admirable." Holt was quiet for a moment and then he said, "He has your brain. He has your stubbornness," she said. "Determination," he said. "That's what I said." Clara started school 2 years later and approached the experience with the focused intensity she brought to everything. And the teacher, who by then had met both Callaway children, wrote Elara a note in the first month saying that Clara was reading at a level 3 years ahead of her age, and asking if it would be all right to give her additional materials. Rosa and Samuel's family had grown as well, a son in 1884 and another in 1886, and the two families spent considerable time together, the children tumbling in and out of each other's houses, and the adults sitting on porches in the evening, and talking about everything and nothing with the ease of people who have known each other long enough not to require occasions. In the summer of 1888, a stranger came to Caldwell. This was not, in itself, unusual. Caldwell had always been a town of arrivals. But this particular stranger presented himself at the Harris store one afternoon, while Elara was there going over the weekly accounts, and he asked for her by name, specifically. And when she came out from behind the counter, she found herself looking at a man she had last seen 7 years ago, when she had been married to him. Arthur Voss had not aged well. He was thinner, with a drawn quality to his face, and he looked around the store with the eyes of a man in a new and unfamiliar environment. He was, she noted with the objective clarity she had cultivated across many years of practice, not a threat. He was tired. "Elara," he said. "Mr. Voss," she said. "I wasn't sure you'd see me." "I am seeing you," she said. "What do you want?" He had come, it turned out, to return something, a piece of jewelry that had belonged to her grandmother that she had left behind when she departed Cincinnati and that he had held without knowing quite why until something had prompted him to do the right thing with it. He produced it from his jacket pocket, a small garnet ring, and held it out. She looked at the ring and then at him. "Why now?" she asked. "It isn't mine," he said. "It was never mine." He paused. "And I heard you where I heard things had gone well for you. I'm glad of it." She took the ring. It was her grandmother's, and it belonged to Clara now, or would eventually. "Thank you for returning it," she said, because that was the honest and accurate thing to say. "I'm sorry," he said more quietly. For he gestured vaguely, which was the gesture of a man who does not have the precise words for the territory he is trying to describe. "I know," she said, which was not forgiveness and was not condemnation. It was acknowledgment, which was all she had to give him, and which she thought was more than sufficient. He left on the afternoon stage. She watched the stage pull out from the window of the store and felt nothing much, which turned out to be the cleanest possible ending to that chapter. She told Holt about it that evening matter-of-factly, as she always told him things of importance. He listened without interrupting, his hands around his coffee cup. "Are you all right?" he asked when she had finished. "I am," she said. "Entirely," he nodded. "Do you want to talk about it more?" "Not particularly," she said. "I have the ring. I'll give it to Clara when she's older." She looked at him. "That part of my life has been over for a long time, Holt. Today was just the formal paperwork." He smiled at that, small and warm. "Formal paperwork," he said. "I am at heart an accountant," she said. He reached across the kitchen table and took her hand, turned it over, pressed his lips briefly to her palm, which was something he did when words were smaller than what he meant. She curled her fingers around his hand and held it. The ranch had by 1889 become one of the more substantial operations in that part of the county. Not the largest, but notable for its consistency and the quality of its management, which people in the area attributed to Holt's skill with cattle and his unflappable calm, and which Elara knew also had something to do with the fact that the books were always right, and the decisions were always made on accurate information. She had never sought credit for this and did not require it. The work itself was the reward, the specific satisfaction of a system operating correctly. James, now 8, was beginning to show the kind of interest in the ranch that suggested the land would have a caretaker into the next generation, and Holt taught him with the same patience he had shown Elara on horseback, seriously and without condescension, treating the questions of an 8-year-old with the respect due to a person genuinely trying to understand. Clara, 6, was interested in the books. This had become apparent gradually, the way things become apparent when they are true. She would sit beside Elara at the oak desk and watch with the focused quality that Elara recognized as real engagement, not boredom, and one afternoon she had asked what all the columns meant, and Elara had explained, and Clara had listened and then asked 3 questions that were so precisely the right questions that Elara had to take a moment to collect herself. "You want to learn?" Elara asked. "Yes," Clara said, with the directness that was her father's. "Then I'll teach you," Elara said, with the directness that was her own. Holt, told of this development, leaned against the doorframe of the study and looked at his daughter and then at his wife and said, "Heaven help Caldwell when she's grown." "Heaven help everyone," Elara agreed, with pride. It was in the fall of 1889, a Saturday, when something happened that would become a story the family told for many years afterward. Elara had ridden into town. She was a competent rider now, no longer just adequate, and was finishing the week's accounts at the Harris store when she overheard 2 men at the counter talking about the Callaway ranch with a quality of appreciation that made her still and listen. They were cattle buyers from Wichita passing through, and one of them was saying to the other that the Callaway operation was one of the ones worth watching, that it had the kind of steady growth that indicated real management rather than luck. "Who runs it?" the other man asked. "Callaway himself, Holt Callaway, but I've heard his wife runs the financial side of the operation, does the books for half the town." "A woman," the first man confirmed. There was a pause. "Well," said the second man. "Good for them, I suppose." "Good for them," the first man said again. "The numbers bear it out." Elara finished the accounts, put on her coat, and rode home in the late afternoon light with a feeling that was not quite pride and not quite satisfaction, but something that contained both and was broader than either. The feeling of a life that had added up correctly. The feeling of a ledger that balanced. Holt was on the porch when she rode in, watching the south pasture where the last light was doing something magnificent to the grass. He heard her coming and turned, and his face when he saw her had that thing it always had, that particular quality of gladness that was not performed and not diminished by familiarity, which was one of the things she had come to understand was not ordinary, not something to be taken as a matter of course. She unsaddled Molasses and put her in the paddock and went up the porch steps and stood beside him, looking out at the light on the grass. "Good day," he asked. "Very good," she said. James came banging out of the door behind them, announcing that supper was ready because he had been helping Dex's wife, who had taken over the cooking twice a week now, and Clara appeared a moment later with a smear of ink on her fingers that indicated she had been at the account books without permission, which Elara noted and decided to address with more amusement than strictness. They went inside to supper, all four of them, in the house that had grown to hold them, in the life that had been built from nothing and patience and honest work, and two people who had looked at each other across a dusty Kansas street and seen, with the particular clarity that sometimes comes like that something was beginning. It was on a warm evening in the summer of 1890 that the moment came which Elara would later understand was the one that contained everything else. They were sitting on the porch after supper, the children inside and the night settling around the ranch with the particular depth of a country night, the stars considerable above them, and the prairie sounds ongoing and familiar. They had been talking about the fall plans, the cattle run and the fence repair, and the question of whether to take on a third hired hand as the operation expanded. And then the conversation had shifted, the way it did between people who have had enough conversation that the transitions are easy, into something less practical. She was not sure exactly how they got to the subject. But she found herself saying, "Do you ever think about the time before we knew each other? That year and a half when I was at the boarding house and you were out here." He was quiet for a moment, the way he was quiet when he was thinking rather than when he had nothing to say. "Sometimes," he said. "What do you think about it?" He turned to look at her, and in the starlight his face was clear and his eyes were direct. "I think about what it was like to wait," he said, "for you to be ready. For the situation for things to resolve themselves. You waited," she said, something shifting in the way she heard the word. "You were waiting even then." He looked at her steadily. "About October of 1879, he said, "when I understood what was happening and what couldn't happen yet." She turned to look at him fully. "You waited 2 years for me?" she asked, and her voice was not quite steady. He removed his hat, that particular gesture of his that meant he was entirely serious, that he was not taking cover behind anything, that what he was saying was plain and meant to be received plainly. He held the hat in his hands and looked at her. "Yes," he said. She looked at him for a long moment, at this man who had come out of his own history with his own losses and his own quiet stubbornness, and his own way of building things from whatever was available, who had been leaning against a post on a Tuesday afternoon in May of 1879, and had seen her standing in the street, and had said something practical about getting out of the way of traffic, and had not forgotten her after. "Holt," she said. "I know," he said, which was the thing he said when words were not quite adequate to the territory. "That is," she stopped. "I don't have the right word for what that is." "It wasn't hard," he said. "That's the part I want you to understand. It wasn't waiting in the way that hurts. It was more like," he turned the hat in his hands, "like knowing something is there, and just being patient about it." She reached out and took the hat from his hands and set it on the porch railing, and then she took his hands in both of hers and looked at him in the wide Kansas night with 11 years of knowledge between them, and still, that particular thing that had been there from the beginning, which had not diminished but had only got more precise, more clearly itself. "I love you," she said. "You insufferably patient, wonderful man." He laughed that laugh, the low, genuine one. "I love you," he said. "You impossibly precise, wonderful woman." She leaned her head against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and they sat that way on the porch of the ranch that had been built from nothing, in the night that was full of stars, with the children inside and the prairie around them, and the life they had made together as present and solid as the ground beneath them. In the years that followed, the Callaway Ranch became something that people in that part of Kansas pointed to as an example of what patient and honest effort could produce. Not the largest operation, not the most dramatic, but steady and well-managed and increasingly prosperous. Adding land in 1891, when the opportunity came, and a proper barn in 1892 that Holt and James built together over the course of a summer that James, now 11, would later say was one of the best experiences of his life. Elara's accounting work had by that point expanded into something that operated more like a formal practice, with 3 regular clients and a growing reputation that brought occasional inquiries from businesses as far away as Wichita. She had hired Alice, her former apprentice, as a full partner in 1891, and together they had built something that Elara recognized as what she had always been capable of, given the appropriate circumstance and the appropriate freedom. Rosa and Samuel's family continued to be deeply woven into the fabric of their life. Rosa's sons, Miguel and Eduardo, were close in age to James and Clara, and the 4 children formed a unit of operation that was occasionally chaotic and always entertaining. Rosa herself had become one of the most essential people in Elara's life, the kind of friend who exists at the center of your experience rather than the periphery, who knew the whole story because she had been present for enough of it to understand the parts she had missed. Clara Callaway, at 10 years old, was keeping a practice ledger with a precision that made Elara's teaching feel effortless, and she had already identified 3 errors in the method Elara used for tracking seasonal expenses and proposed alternative approaches, 2 of which were genuinely better. She had her father's eyes and her mother's mind, and a quality of her own that was neither of them, some original and particular thing that was already visible as the outline of the adult she would become. James had the ranch in him the way Holt did, that deep practical attentiveness to land and animals and weather, and he rode with a natural ease that had outpaced his teaching and become its own thing. He was also, unexpectedly, a reader consuming books with the same quiet enthusiasm Holt brought to them, and the shelf in the sitting room that had once held Elara's handful of volumes had expanded across 3 walls and required a library system that Clara had organized in 1892 with the seriousness of a junior archivist. On the evening of their 13th wedding anniversary, Holt and Elara sat on the porch again, as they had 1,000 times before, in the warm June night with the fireflies beginning and the stars overhead. "Tell me something you haven't told me yet," she said. It was something she said sometimes, because even after 13 years she believed there were things still to learn, and she liked the idea of that, the ongoing depth of another person. He was quiet for a moment, thinking. Then he said, "When I came into Fletcher's store that very first fall when we first started talking properly, I almost didn't come back after the second time." She turned to look at him. "Why?" "Because I could already see where it was going," he said, "and I knew the situation, and I thought." He paused. "I thought it might be simpler to let it go." "What changed your mind?" He looked out at the dark prairie. "I thought about simpler," he said. "And then I thought about better, and I decided I could manage complicated if the thing at the end of it was better." She looked at him for a long moment, at the profile of the man who had chosen complicated and managed it with the quiet stubbornness of someone who believed in the work. "I'm glad you came back," she said. "So am I," he said. She took his hand, and they sat in the warm evening as they had so many times before, not in the easy comfort of people who no longer notice each other, but in the settled and particular happiness of people who have built something together and can see it around them everywhere they look, in the house behind them and the land extending out to the dark horizon and the children who would inherit both, and in each other, always in each other, which was the first and last of all of it. Mrs. Aldridge, who had declined considerably in health by 1893 but maintained her characteristic precision about it, told Elara on a Sunday visit that the best decision she had ever made was renting that small room to a young woman from Cincinnati with nothing but a leather satchel and an insufficiency of funds. "You made the town better," she said, from her chair by the window. "The town made me better," Elara said, which was also true. Mrs. Aldridge died peacefully in the spring of 1894, and Elara and Rosa organized the memorial with the same practical love she had brought to everything. And the boarding house, which she had left to a niece in Topeka, was bought shortly after by a young couple from Missouri who arrived in Caldwell with nothing but determination and 2 children, and the particular quality of people who have decided to build something. Elara helped them with the accounts in the first year, charging them nothing, because she remembered what it was to arrive without enough and find that someone was willing to help you find the next step. The summer of 1895 was the one that James Callaway always said, looking back, was when everything became clear to him. He was 14, and he had spent the season working the ranch with full seriousness, not as a boy helping but as a person learning a trade that would eventually be his. Holt taught him with the care and the directness that he brought to everything, and there was between them in those years a quality of communication that went past language, the comfortable working silence of 2 people who understand the same things and do not need to translate. One evening, after a long day's work, James said to his father, "Did you always know you wanted this? The ranch?" Holt considered it. "Not this exactly," he said. "Something of my own, land that was mine, work that was real." He looked at his son. "The rest of it, your mother, this place, you and your sister, that I couldn't have planned." "Was it what you expected?" James asked. Holt was quiet for a moment. "It was better," he said, "considerably better than what I expected." James nodded with the seriousness of a young person storing information for future reference. Clara, at 13, had outgrown the practice ledger and was working real accounts under Elara's supervision, with a competence that drew a letter from the accountant in Wichita who had heard of her through a business contact, expressing interest in meeting her when she was of working age. Elara read the letter and thought about her own trajectory, the uncle's firm in Cincinnati and the limitations, and the long road to Caldwell and the oak desk. And she wrote back to the Wichita accountant saying that Clara Callaway would be in touch when she was ready, on her own terms and timeline, and that he should consider himself fortunate to have heard of her early. She showed the letter to Holt. He read it and handed it back and said, "Well done." "She earned it," Elara said. "You both did," he said. She pinned the letter to the board above her desk, beside the article from the St. Louis paper and a drawing James had made of the ranch at age 7, because it was the kind of thing that should be displayed, the evidence of a life adding up in the right direction. In the final years of the century, Caldwell changed again, as all towns changed with the closing of the frontier era. The cattle drives fewer now, the railroad dominant, the raw wildness of the earlier decades giving way to something more settled. New families arrived. A proper bank branch opened. The school expanded. The world outside Kansas was doing its own changing, and some of that found its way into the conversations on porches and in stores and over supper tables, the slow awareness of a larger world pressing against the edges of a known one. But the Callaway Ranch persisted in its own good logic, solid and productive, the land paid for, and the books balanced, and the family within it growing in the ways that families do when they have been built on honest foundations. James took on more of the ranch work with each passing year, and Holt watched this with the quiet pride of a man watching something he has built perform exactly as intended, which is a specific and profound pleasure. On a Sunday afternoon in the fall of 1899, the whole family sat down to dinner together with Rosa and Samuel and their sons, now young men, and the table was loud and full, and several conversations ran simultaneously in the cheerful collision that happens when people know each other well enough not to require order. Clara was explaining to Eduardo something about the methodology for projecting quarterly income that she had revised, and Eduardo was listening with the expression of a young man who was paying more attention than the occasion strictly required, which Elara noted. James was arguing good-naturedly with Miguel about something related to cattle, and Samuel was telling Holt about a commission he had received for a furniture order from a hotel in Wichita, which was the largest commission of his career. Elara sat at one end of the table and Holt at the other, and the noise of the people they loved was around them like weather, and she caught his eye across the length of the table, and he held her gaze for a moment with that steady directness she had been looking at for 20 years, since a Tuesday morning in May of 1879 on the main street of Caldwell, and she thought, as she often thought, that the numbers of this life added up to something beyond calculation. She raised her glass slightly. He raised his. Neither of them said anything, because they did not need to. The whole room was the thing they were toasting. Later, when the guests had gone and the children, young adults now, but still hers, had drifted off to their rooms, and the house had settled into its nighttime quiet, Holt came to find her where she was standing at the window of the study, looking out at the dark ranch. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "About the beginning," she said. "About arriving here with nothing and being told to get out of the street." He came to stand beside her, close, his arm against hers. "You had something," he said. "You had more than you knew." "So did you," she said. "Yes," he agreed, "but I think I knew it." She turned to look at him, this man who had waited 2 years with the patience of someone who understood that important things move at their own pace and cannot be hurried without being damaged, who had built a life with his hands and his steadiness and his particular kind of love, which was practical and deep and did not require ornament. "Holt," she said. "Elara," he said, equally quiet, equally serious, equally present. She took his hand and held it, and they stood at the window of the house they had built in the country they had claimed, in the life that had been made from the meeting of 2 people on a dusty Kansas street in the spring of 1879, when neither of them could have told you exactly what was beginning, only that something was. The stars were out over the ranch, the same stars that had been there on the night she arrived, and on the night he had told her he had waited, and on every night between and since, constant and clear above the flat country, above the land they owned, and the house they had filled, and the family they had made and would go on making in all the ways that families continue. In the children who would inherit the land and the books and the stories and the particular quality of attention that had been their parents' most essential inheritance to pass along. All of it present, all of it accounted for, all of it adding up exactly right.